All right, I guess I'll take over for the rest of the evening. Now, for those who missed what I mentioned this morning, we've been building up to studying the book of Revelation. If you joined us with our last series, we were going through the book of Daniel. And there's actually a couple of reasons for that. The first reason I said is, a lot of times when people come to the book of Revelation, one of the things that they argue about is it's very difficult to understand because it has so much imagery in it. And it's fine, and that's true because the book of Revelation is one of the two full books that are written in the apocalyptic style, Daniel being the other one. Now, the apocalyptic style also appears in the book of Ezekiel and Zechariah, but Daniel and Revelation are the two. And the other reason that I chose Daniel is because Daniel and Revelation actually coincide with each other. And what I mean by that is Daniel, when we looked at it, you were given glimpses at human history. You're given, in Daniel 7, you're given the 4 beasts, and you're given in the final beast, you're given about 10 horns. And then when you get to chapter 8, it only covers up until the Greek empires, and then up until Antiochus IV in history. And then when we hit chapters 10, 11, and 12, chapter 11, which is the central of it, covers the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic empires in history. And again, up until Antiochus IV and the Maccabean revolts, all covered in Daniel. And then it jumps all the way to the end. It jumps to the final battle with what we call the Battle of Armageddon, or the Battle at Megiddo, where Daniel 11 even talks about the one he calls the King of the North, his final campaign, and then he settles his tents of his palace, is what it says, between the great mountain and the sea, or the sea and the great mountain. And that's the Valley of Megiddo, what we call Armageddon. And so Revelation covers what happens there, but then the question is, what's happening in between those two things? What's happening in between the coming of the Messiah and his ministry until the end? And the book of Revelation basically fills in everything else. And even the name Revelation really means to reveal something that was once hidden. And at the end of the book of Daniel, if you're with us last week, Daniel was told to seal this up until the time of the end. And well, Revelation becomes the time of the end. And this series, we're going to be unpacking the book of Revelation. We're going to work our way through it. It'll take us a while. Daniel took, I think, in the end, I think it was 18 weeks. I think some of the chapters took a little bit longer. And as we go through it, and we look at Revelation, we're going to be seeing that this is really going to be unpacking that last week of Daniel. And as we looked at the 70 weeks of Daniel, it talked about 62 weeks, then it talked about 7 weeks, and then it just mentioned the final week. And in Daniel, as we looked at it, those weeks are sets of years. And from the command to restore Jerusalem and to reestablish it until the coming of the Messiah was set to be 62 weeks and 7 weeks, which led to the 69 weeks, the 490 years. Except we're missing the final week, and Daniel doesn't really cover it in detail. This is what Revelation uncovers, the final week. And so we're going to be looking at it. And the other reason, as I said, it goes along with it. If you remember, Daniel chapter 10, verse 25, talks about the angel comes, he says, I've come to tell you what's in the book of truth, or the scroll of truth, depending on which word they want to use there. And the scroll of truth, or the book of truth, is one of kind of 3 books that there is. You got the book of truth, which is the record of human history already recorded by God's hand. And this is why, even throughout the scriptures, you can see the Apostle Paul making reference to things such as Jesus being slain before the foundation of the world. Now that's a very historical event that took place, but it means it was already, in essence, on the books that it was going to happen. And so when the angel shows up to Daniel, he's like, look, I'm going to reveal to you the section that you're really interested in, or that you've been struggling with. And that was the time of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, leading up to Antiochus. And so the Revelation, if you want, is a portion of the book of truth. Which portion is it here? It's the time of the end. And so that's why it's one that is vitally important. And tonight, we're not going to be doing too much in-depth in Revelation, but we are going to be doing the introduction here. And one thing I'm going to ask is whoever watching their time, let me know when 7 o'clock comes, because I don't have a clock visible of me, so when my time's up. I thought my clock would be visible, but it's not. Just let me know when we're getting 5 minutes so I can wrap up here. But tonight, we're going to be looking at some of the detail. One of the major details that we're going to discuss tonight is, when was the book of Revelation written? And the reason that it's so important is because there's really two viewpoints, or two sets of when Revelation was written, and they will affect how you understand the book. And the first is that it was written during around 60 AD. Now, why is that important? Now, throughout history, in biblical history, there are a couple of dates that you should know if you want to understand the history. One is 720 BC, another is 586 BC, and the third one is 70 AD. Now, what are those three events? 720 AD is the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. That's when it fell to the Assyrians. 586 BC is when the southern kingdom of Judah fell to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. 70 AD is the destruction of the temple by Emperor Titus. And those are three very important dates in biblical history, understand. And the destruction of the temple is important because the question arises, is the book of Revelation similar to the book of Daniel in that it's already happened? Or is it yet to take place? And that question is vital importance to understanding the book of Revelation. Now, for those who say that it's all already been written, they would say that John wrote in around the 60s AD, and it was all fulfilled in 70 AD. So it was all leading up to that. So when it talks about almost like an antichrist and all that, that was all fulfilled under Emperor Nero and accumulated with the destruction of the temple. For those who hold it was written later, well, we would hold that it's all future. And that's vitally important for us, because if it's all history, then it just becomes nice knowledge to understand. But if it's future, that means it's something we've got to pay attention to, because it's going to come to pass. Now, I will tell you, this week in studying, I was playing around with ChatGPT. If you're not familiar with that, most youth coming up are very familiar with it. In fact, it's actually a major problem in schools right now. The easiest way is to understand it is ChatGPT is classified as an artificial intelligence that grabs information from the internet and can provide it for you very, very quickly. So like a search engine, but much more in depth. So on a search engine like Google, if I ask it, give me a recipe for pancakes, what'll happen is it'll give me websites that I now got to search through. ChatGPT won't do that. I'll just say, give me a homemade recipe for pancakes, and it will give me the recipe. It basically searches the websites and gives me the idea. And the problem that is in school is you've got students who aren't even doing papers anymore. They'll be like, okay, write me an opinion piece on Alexander's conquest. They'll just go to ChatGPT and say, write a paper on Alexander's conquest. copy it, and paste it. And I know even my oldest son, I think it was about this semester, this last term, they came home with regulations on what to write papers. And he's now has to write, when he writes his stuff, he's doing it in Google Classroom, which is fine. But things that flag are if too much text has been copied into it and not written. If there's no spelling errors or anything like that, and grammatical errors, they're like, oh, this is more likely it was written by AI. Now, AI is not perfect. It obviously makes mistakes. One of the things I love to do sometimes is I took one of my own emails that I sent out and I did what's called an AI checker, and it declared that my email was 98% likely written by AI, which is fascinating, given I wrote it.
Sometimes our pastors
I know I can be robotic at times, but come on. I've also had it flag me for like 50% plagiarism. And I'm like, okay, which sections are plagiarized?
Book of Revelation.
Well, the opening that I write, grace be to you from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ. The conclusion, like, wow, you plagiarized from the scriptures. Yeah, it reminds me of a comic I saw where a pastor was on the stage. He goes, yes, I know that most of my sermon is coming from the Bible. No, I don't classify that as plagiarism. So it's not perfect, but I use it a little bit, and I'll ask it sometimes certain questions. And one of the questions I asked this week was, and I word it this way: without bias, is it more likely or not that Jesus rose from the dead? And the reason I got to say without bias is because the first thing they'll do is disregard supernatural. And as soon as I allow for divine intervention based on the evidence, they're like, yeah, the resurrection of Jesus is historical, that it really happened based on the eyewitness testimonies, the documents, the historical records. It is. So I decided to do this with the book of Revelation. Based on the evidence, without bias, when was the book of Revelation written? And it brought the two viewpoints that I was already familiar with. One is classified as the preterist viewpoint, which is it's all fulfilled. It was fulfilled time Nero and Emperor Titus, and that's fine. The other one is, no, it was written later. And so we classify this as the futurist. So it makes sense. It's either past or it's future.
Can it not be both?
It can. There's the partial preterist view. And when it comes down to it, that is one of them. There are people that hold that view. R.C. Sproul, for example, holds the view of partial preterist. That means some of it has already been completed. The rest has not. But when it comes to the partial preterist view, even in that view, it's not the book of Revelation that gets that. It's Matthew 24 to 26, Mark's account of it, and Luke's account of it. The Olivet Discourse. They'll classify as that. And up to a point, very small of it of Revelation is. And so what you're classifying is, yes, the partial preterist view. So like I said, R.C. Sproul is that way. Someone like John MacArthur is futurist in that aspect. So there is some wiggle room here. But it's important to understand which viewpoint is it. Now, I don't just like telling you that, according to the evidence, futurist is the most consensus. I want you to know why. Because one of the things I prefer to teach as Christians grow up and as we disciple people is not just believe this. It's why. Because unlike the other faith, what you classify as the major faiths in the world, with the exception of Judaism, so things like Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, they are not based on historical truth. They're based on what you classify as just matters of faith. You take it that it happened. So, for example, Joseph Smith and his golden tablets. Well, where are they? Where's the record of it? Where did any of that actually take place? There's no archaeological or historical reference ever of golden tablets for Joseph Smith. Even when it comes to Islam, there's no historical actual evidence for the claims of Islam. Now, that doesn't bother them, but historically, when it comes to Christianity, Christianity is not just a matter of faith. It's a faith that is established and built on the historical, archaeological evidence of the reality of Jesus Christ. And I can give you, like I said, with evidence, that the evidence points to a creator. That's another one I asked ChatGPT. Based on the evidence, is it more likely that the universe was created or that it came from nothing? And they're like, in the end, based on the evidence without bias, it is more likely, due to like the fine-tuned arguments, and there's a variety of arguments, that the universe has a creator. And then it added, unless you allow for a multiverse theory, which is just basically there's an infinite number of multiverses and we just happen to be in the one that succeeded. There is no evidence for that, but that's just a theory people want. So when it comes to understanding that Revelation is not something that already passed, I want to give you evidence for it. Like I said, even if you don't remember everything, it gives a strong base. Now, I will give one notion. One of the tenets of being a Baptist, and particularly a Protestant in Baptists in particular, Protestants hold that the Bible is the only creed. Now, what does that mean? The Bible is our utmost authority on all faith and practices. In Catholicism, they don't hold that. They hold that it's Scripture plus tradition. Now, unfortunately, what often happens is, and this is why I said the problem with that, is trying to hold two pillars or two authorities like that. The Catholic Church relies on tradition to interpret the Scriptures. On the other side, what has happened in Protestants is they've often thrown out traditions, or they've thrown out the church, what you classify as the church fathers, or the fathers of the faith, where we shouldn't have. And the reason I say it is particularly there's one person, and he dates back to about 180 AD. His name is Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a student of a man named Polycarp. Polycarp was a student of the Apostle John. So you're talking within 2 generations. And Irenaeus quoted Polycarp stating that John wrote Revelation. And he wrote it at the end of the reign of Domitian. And when in history did Domitian rule? From 81 to 96. After the destruction of the temple. And this is important to understand because when Revelation talks about certain things happening in the temple and makes references to the temple, if the temple was already destroyed when John wrote it, he can't be referring to something in his day. He's got to be referring to something future. And if you often wonder, why do we hold that Israel's going to rebuild their temple? Well, this is why. Because we're told that the abomination which causes desolation will come. Well, the Antichrist will enter into the temple and declare himself God. This can only happen if a temple has been established. And if it was destroyed in John's day, he can't be referring to something that already happened, because he refers to the future. And with that, the other church fathers, Clement of Alexandria, Victorius, Eusebius, they all echo the exact same view of Irenaeus, that John wrote it in 90 AD, or 90-ish AD. And even when it comes, so that's what we classify as external evidence. Internal evidence means, what does the text show? Well, Revelation chapters 2 and 3, they don't seem to indicate a church that is necessarily under duress. The description of the churches and the problems that they're facing seem more to be second and third generation churches. Don't underestimate how much a church can change in 1 or 2 generations. It really can. Just look at the state of the churches today. And just look at how a church that, even if it was established 40, 50, 60 years ago, how within just a change of leadership can change completely. Even when it comes to the Israelites, when they come out of Egypt, within 1 generation, how much changed. Even within, if you want, in the land of Egypt, and it says a Pharaoh arose who didn't know Joseph. It doesn't mean he didn't know who he was. It means he didn't care. And constantly this would happen, even in Israel. That's one of the things about the book of Judges. When the old guard died off, the new guard rose up and they just went crazy. And so the issues that are arisen from the early churches, issues of the complacency and wealth, there's no urgency, there's no persecution that the early church faced. So it doesn't seem to indicate that it would be within the 60s. It would be later. And the other kind of real nail in the coffin of the idea that it was written early, as I said, the idea that it's written early and fulfilled is the preterist view. That view didn't come into existence until about the 17th century. And it was actually put forth mostly by a Spanish Jesuit priest named Luis de Alcazar. And why is that important? Because by this time the Reformation has happened, and as they studied the book of Revelation, and if you studied history and the Reformation, do you know who Martin Luther depicted as either the false prophet or the Antichrist? It was the Pope. And guess what the Catholic Church wanted to get away from? That the Pope is the Antichrist. How can you do that? It's already happened. Now, I'm not saying the Pope's the Antichrist. I'm saying that was a prevalent view in the 17th century. And so he redirected, saying, hey, this already took place. This already happened. And so the first thing you got to understand is the source of that information. This is one of the things when you study biblical scholarship, especially modern scholarship, if you really study the scriptures, and you run into modern day things, be careful to understand where the source is coming from. Because a lot of these things which saying, oh, this is later, that there's so many authors to Isaiah, that it was written afterwards and all this, it's coming from usually within the last 150, 200 years. During a time where they want to get away from God. They want to get away from the supernatural. And therefore they exclude it, any possibility of it. Now, he started preterist, but it started to hit a little more in the Protestant movements by a Dutch Protestant named Hugo Grotius. And I know if Astor and Viltner here, they'd probably slaughter me over the pronunciation of the last name. And he developed kind of a non-Catholic view of it. They changed a few details, but it never really took off. And it didn't even gain any ground until, like I said, the last 150, 200 years. Where it's like, it's no longer supernatural. And so, the reason, again, that I want to put that on, maybe if you forget most of that, is that the evidence points to the book of Revelation being written in the 90s after the temple was already destroyed and Emperor Titus had come through. And the reason that that's important is because it means that it's yet to take place. Which means it's an event we're looking forward to. So that it's going to take place. So when we study the book of Revelation, we don't just flat out dismiss these things saying, oh, it already took place. The book of Revelation, even John is told this, that I'm going to show you things that were, things that are, and things that are yet to take place. And the book of Revelation covers this. Chapter 12, particularly in Revelation, covers things that were, and things that are, and things that will happen. So it covers the coming of the Messiah, the birth of the child, the birth of the Messiah, things that take place, and what will take place. And so as we study Revelation, we have to understand that it is telling what will take place. The other reason is, back to my original point, why we study Daniel. Let's see if we remember the one lesson from Daniel that I said. What is the most important thing that I say? If you remember nothing else from the book of Daniel, what was the most important thing?
God's sovereignty.
The sovereignty of God. Daniel showed the sovereignty of God over history. So when we come to Revelation, and I said that originally the two arguments that people don't study Revelation: one, it's hard because of the symbolism. That's why we studied Daniel. Two, it's scary. It's frightening. We don't have to worry about it because it's under the sovereignty of God. And so when we start to read things and we study things like the judgments that are coming, and we read about these demonic locusts, we read about this horseman army that are going out to cause pain, devastation, we don't have to worry about this. And one of the things that we have to remember too, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 says this, that we are not appointed to wrath. God can easily protect his own versus those who he pours out his wrath on. A great example of this, Genesis 18, Abraham talking to God as he's looking over Sodom. And as they talk, Abraham is made known that God is going to destroy Sodom. And Abraham's question to God, which sets off the whole dialogue, is, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? And God's response is, I will. And then you get Abraham's kind of negotiating with God. If you find 50, will you spare it? All the way down to 10. And even though there weren't 10 found, and truly only one righteous man was found, he was not destroyed. He was delivered. When the entire earth was corrupt and full of violence in the day of Noah, Noah and his family, the righteous Noah, was not caught in the wrath of God. And so even with God, if God pours out on his wrath, God knows who are his. And in fact, you get this statement in the book of Revelation, where it's the four angels, which are for judgment, are told to stop and wait until God's own are sealed. And then you start to hear through the book of Revelation that, and they only hit those who did not have the seal of God, or they only hit those who had the mark. What does this show? That God, who is sovereign, he is sovereign over all events, and he protects his own. We are not appointed to wrath. So why should we be afraid of the book of Revelation? One, we know who's in command of it, and God does not commit friendly fire. God is able to protect his own. And so when you come to the book of Revelation, this is why you get something here. Verse 3, and it's echoed later in Revelation. Revelation 1 verse 3. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it. Why is there a blessing on us? Because for us, it is not about fear. Now, for the unbeliever, it should be. They should read these things and be petrified if they understand them. But for the believer, it's like, no, this is a blessing. What is actually taking place? It's God answering the prayer that people have been praying for centuries. When will God deal with evil? When will God put an end to wickedness? The book of Revelation is God pouring out his wrath, and the believer should be going, blessed is he who comes. It's like, true and just are your judgments, O God. It's like, you have redeemed us. You have saved us. You have avenged the blood of your saints. And when we read Revelation, we hear this. And again, one of the things that is beautiful at the end of chapter 6, the question is asked, and it's asked by the wicked, and the judgment of God is being poured out, and they're saying, the wrath of the Lamb has come, who can stand? Revelation 7 answers this question. Who can stand? It's those who have been sealed by God. And this is where you get the 144,000, and we'll talk about that when we get there. What does that actually mean? And then I looked, John says, and I saw not just from Israel, I saw from every tribe, tongue, and nation, those who had been redeemed and come out of the great tribulation. He talks about an infinite number beyond what he can count. Even later, when it talks about the fact that the beast, and this again, it's from the wicked asking this question, they're saying, how powerful is the beast? Who can stand against him? The answer is given in the very next section. And it says, and I looked, and there are those who are victorious over the beast by the word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. The victory comes through Christ. And so Revelation shouldn't make us fear at all. And when we even face difficulties in our daily life, we shouldn't fear. Why? And this is the same thing I've been driving home, that our hope is not built on the government system. It's not built on what is going on around us. Our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus Christ and him and his righteousness. And so when we read Revelation, it is a blessing to us. As I said, Revelation starts with that blessing and it ends with that blessing. And so blessed are those who read and hear. And so we have that encouragement. And when we look at Revelation, as I said, I want us to understand, it's filling in the blanks of Daniel. So as you read Daniel and Revelation together, and Daniel just kind of jumps from Antiochus, if you understand this, Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, to the Antichrist and his final defeat. Revelation fills in what leads up to that. And that's why we studied it all. And so, as we look at it, we should be encouraged. Now, I want to just go through a little bit. I touched on verse 3, but I want to touch verses 1 and 2 as well to understand this. Now, if I asked, who's the author of Revelation? Our first answer and our first response is probably going to be John the Apostle. Now, as much as that is true, John the Apostle here is like me asking you who wrote the book of Jeremiah. And your answer is probably going to be, it's not Jeremiah though. It's Baruch, the scribe. He's actually the author. In fact, Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah tells us this, that Baruch writes everything down. John is not the author of Revelation. He's the scribe. Jesus is the author of Revelation. Look at the very first thing that he writes. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. Jesus is the one who reveals it. He's actually the author here. Now, John's the scribe. Now, John writes notes, and scribes do that. That's why you can see that even in other things. It's the same as I ask you, who wrote Paul's letters? Well, ultimately, Paul did. But truthfully, more than likely, Paul used a scribe. Especially when you get a spot where he writes, see how I write this with big letters in my own hand. Because his sight wasn't the greatest. And so he'd often use a scribe. Sometimes it would be Luke. Sometimes it'd be probably another scribe that he's hired who would write the letters for him. But here it's Jesus revealing it. So the revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now it's interesting. Notice that he says, which God gave him to show who? His servants. This isn't a letter that's written just to John. This isn't something just for John. The book of Revelation was written to all believers of all time, for them to read it, for them to understand it, for them to be encouraged by it. And it was written also to John, his servant John. John includes himself in that. And so, again, if Revelation was written only to people during the time of Emperor Nero, which is when a preterist would say, well, then it wouldn't be written to all his servants. It would be written to those at that time. But it's written for you, for me, for all believers. And so if it's written to us, then we should read it and seek to understand it. One of the shows I like to watch is Candace vs. Handyman. Now, it's not on the air anymore. It did 6 seasons, and I think it was it was on the air like 15 years ago. You can still watch it on YouTube. It's all there. And one of the things that frustrates the host more than anything is when they're like, this doesn't work, and he walks in, the first thing he says is, did you read the instructions? You know what the response usually is? No. It's like, no wonder you're having such a hard time. We've been given what is going to take place. And if we're sitting there going, why are things happening? Why is this happening? Why are things going on? The response should be, well, have you read the instructions? Have you read what is coming? And because it's a revelation of Jesus Christ to his servants. And it written to his servant John, it says, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ and to all the things he saw. So John is writing exactly what he was told to write. And that's why he adds, you're blessed if you read this. You're blessed if you keep it. And so as we go through Revelation, tonight I know I gave you probably some history. I know you're probably going to walk out and you're going to forget a lot of that middle section, which is fine. And I understand that. In a lesson that lasts anything more than 15 minutes, people generally
Shut it off.
Yeah. And that's why I emphasize everything at the start and the end. It's why I try to do that. I'm well aware of that. Why do you think I put what you classify as the boring information in the middle? But in the end, it's the same thing that we had with Daniel. Don't be afraid of the book of Revelation. And it's because we know that God is on his throne. And when John first gets to heaven, what's the first thing he says he sees? A throne, and God is sitting on his throne. That all things are under his command. And because of that, we know that we're in his care. We know that it'll happen just as he said. And since our faith is in him, the book of Revelation isn't frightening for us. It's exciting. Because we know the time is at hand. And we will see our Savior coming. And we will celebrate our King of Kings and Lord of Lords like never before. And that's an exciting thing to look forward to. All right. I'll give a chance if anyone has any questions or anything. Like I said, there shouldn't be too much. Truthfully, it was just an opening. And like I said, if you get anything else, just remember that last bit. That's kind of the way it goes. All right. All right. Well, if that's the case, as always, I say it more for the video than for everybody here. Next week, we'll pick up right in chapter 4, and we're going to start right there. And as we get into where John was and description of Jesus, we have to understand the description that Jesus reveals of himself, because all of that unpacks into Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3 as Jesus describes it. And it reveals who Jesus is as well and what he continues to do. And so then, for next week, now, for those who are online at the taping of this, I just want to plug one thing, and that's our fun day coming up Saturday. Our fun day is coming up this Saturday at the church. The weather still looks like it's supposed to be good, from 11 o'clock until 1. It's open to anybody, and it's free. We've got things like face painting, cotton candy. I was told that we got our snow cone machine. There we go. I wanted to say slushy, but snow cone machine. It's on its way, so we get that as well. And there's other things. There's games going to be happening, so I encourage you to come out to that. Until next time, as always, I pray that you would grow in the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you would continue to seek after him, and may your faith increase and trust in him, knowing that he is sovereign over it all. Blessings with you. Until next time.